Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I think we are ready to start, so we are on the hour, so let's just get started. The hosts here will present ourselves in just a little bit. So we have 1.5 hours together here, and we are very happy and almost maybe a little bit surprised on the interest in this webinar on probability of success in biopharma R&D. So we'll jump right into it. And just before we start, here's a few housekeeping rules. So the webinar will be recorded. So you'll get the recording afterwards, and people unable to attend, they can also look through it. We have a chat, so please use the chat for any questions you might have. And we'll share also the slides besides the recording. And a little bit about us. Maybe I'll hand it over to you, David. You can start.
Sure. Thanks very much, Tom. So hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is a really exciting topic for us to be going through. So my name's David Hartley. A bit of my background. So I used to be the head of portfolio analytics and portfolio finance at GSK. I'm a statistician by background, and I'm obsessed and excited by everything to do with risk. I love risk analysis and risk management, and obviously PTRS is a major component of risk. My academic background actually is specifically in the statistics of expert judgment, which obviously in a PTRS setting becomes really important, and so we'll talk a little bit about that later. And apologies if I get too excited about that and some of the other topics as we go through. But great to see you all here today.
No, but I definitely share the excitement. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be on a webinar on risk assessment on an awesome afternoon here in Denmark. So, David and I, we collaborate on a lot of stuff related to biopharma risk. So there we join forces. And just for your attention, we're actually planning to host some master classes next year on R&D portfolio management and R&D risk management. So we'll keep in touch and how that goes and how we develop that program. So another thing, just briefly, that David and I, we are collaborating on is this pipeline signal project, which is a crowd prediction project. And just you can sign up after the call here, but it's basically an easy to use platform in collaboration with Cultivate Labs, where we can assess or predict individually the outcome of clinical trial events and also regulatory events. But I will get back to that shortly. So I'll just start spending a couple of minutes on the big picture on biopharma R&D risk, because it's a very peculiar industry we are working in. And I quite like this quote from Financial Times, a nice article from a couple of months back. So it's a quote from Daphne Koller from In Vitro, a biotech company, and she said, "I used to say we were the industry with the highest failure rates of anything but space exploration, and then space exploration started to work." And I think that nicely captures that we are working in an industry where failure is the default outcome. And just to remind you of the scale, so we have a global pharma market of around $1.5 trillion annually. And the biopharma R&D spend is in the range of $300 billion. And then we spend a couple of $100 billion on pharma M&A. So sort of the big picture is $500 billion per year is invested in some sort of innovation in this industry. And yet the risk is enormous. So we have, depending a little bit how we count and where we start the counting, then it's a less than 5 to 10% probability of success that we'll actually see a molecule coming out as a drug. So that's exactly the reason why we're here today. So if we can't assess R&D risk right, I mean, we can't do our decisions right for the R&D, we can't make our investments, we can't put a value on our projects and companies. And just to sort of ground us a little bit, what numbers are we actually talking about here? So here it's a little bit busy slide, but if you look at this broken orange line here, you see this is the probability of success going all the way from phase 1 and then through phase 2, phase 3, and regulatory approval, let's say with the FDA. So that is below 10%. But you also see that it's flat as a pancake and has been that for years, actually decades. And it's the same for the individual phases. There's a little bit of fluctuations up or down, but it's almost like random noise, I would say. So if anything, maybe the probability of success has gone down a few percentage points. So the short message is it's very risky and continues to be very risky, and we're not seeing any major improvements. Maybe AI will save us this time, but other technologies have not moved the needle. We also know that when we look at risk, it depends on what category we have our projects in. One way of categorizing is according to therapy areas. So some therapy areas are more challenging than others. For instance, psychiatry is very tricky because the biology is very complicated, not well understood. There's a lack of translational animal models and so on. But it also you see that it fluctuates also over time. So on the right-hand side, you see a panel on cardiovascular disease success rate. And you can see there's a little bit of fluctuation, but it's sometimes there can be regulatory policy changes, there can be targets, validations, and also there is a limited number of let's say phase 3 readouts. So maybe you are unlucky and we have more failures and more successes but it can fluctuate. But overall, it's a pretty steady outlook we have on risk. And the same also for modalities. They also vary by modality. I'll not go into too much detail here, but if we compare, let's say, small molecules, and you see the composite success rate all the way through the clinic to approval is 6%. And if you then look instead at monoclonal antibodies, you can see it's twice as likely to succeed. So there are some liabilities in small molecules that we don't see with monoclonal antibodies. But then there are other considerations like investment profile and cost of the development program. But just to bring the message across that it depends on the therapy area and also what kind of modality we're dealing with. So with that, I will hand it over to you, David.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Simon. So in the next section, we're going to be talking a bit about probability of technical and regulatory success, defining it as a concept, talking through some of the terminology that we're going to be using throughout the session today, and also the scope of what we're talking about. As we were asking people before they signed up for the session, their backgrounds and experience in this topic, we saw a really wide range of responses. Some people had never been engaged in probability of success calculation in the drug development space. Others had been working in this space for years. And so across today, we will try and introduce some of the basic concepts, but also highlight some of the areas that are worth kind of investigating a little bit more. And we'll provide some further insight, so hopefully everyone takes away something from the session. So starting right at the beginning with phase probabilities of success. Obviously, as everyone on this call will know, a drug in an R&D pipeline goes through many phases, typically split into some sort of discovery phase and some sort of development phase, or research and development, depending how your organization likes to talk about it. And at each one of these phases, there's a chance that program is going to move forward, or it's going to stop in some form. And each phase has, therefore, its own probability of success, POS. So this is your phase probability of success. And this measures the likelihood that the drug will go from the phase that it's currently in to the next phase. Sometimes this is called PTS, phase PTS, the phase technical success. And it's measured, as almost all probabilities are, from a scale from 0% that it definitely won't proceed to 100% that it definitely will proceed. Now, it's important to note that from a scope perspective, typically these phase probabilities of successes are first assigned at the preclinical evaluation stage. It's very rare for them to be assigned earlier than that. Typically, what happens is that organizations will have some form of composite score of multiple factors, a little bit more qualitative in nature rather than quantitative, to determine the risk profile for things prior to the preclinical evaluation stage. So we're not going to spend too much time talking about the research section here. We're going to be focused mostly from preclinical evaluation onwards, so that just gives you a kind of a framing of the scope. It's important to note that the phase probability of success is more than just whether the drug is likely to be efficacious. And one of the things that Simon and I have noticed as we've been having conversations in this space across the last few months is that there's a lot of question marks around what is included or excluded from these probabilities of success. And I think the really simple way of thinking about it is that probability of success really is a progression probability. So it should include all of the risks which determine whether or not that drug moves on to the next phase or not. And so if we just talk about the efficacy side of things, so whether it's going to be clinically efficacious, typically what we'd be talking about is an assurance measure. And we'll come on to this in a little bit more detail later when we talk about different methods of calculating it. But assurance is essentially the probability that a planned clinical trial will meet its efficacy objective. And it accounts for both the uncertainty in the true treatment effect and the trial design. So it's related to the power calculation. We're not going to go through all the calculations of assurance today, but you can think of this as an efficacy measure. Sometimes people will use the term PACE in this space to refer to the probability of achieving clinical efficacy. Now, it's important to note that in addition to this element, you need to overlay other elements of risk to really identify your true phase POS. So in order to calculate that phase POS, you need to think about what other sources of risk are there, which may be terminal to progression of the asset within the phase that it's currently in. And so that might be looking at safety and tolerability risk. Is there a toxicity issue that needs to be considered in this space? For example, it might be operational or execution risk. So is there some sort of operational risk based on the way that this development plan is structured, that actually there's going to be issues recruiting patients or things like that? Or it might be CMC or manufacturing risks that need to be included. So when you're calculating this phase POS, you need to bring all of these items together to determine really what your probability is that it's going to move to the next phase or ultimately terminate. Now, in order to get to our probability of technical and regulatory success, we essentially need to ladder up these phase probability of successes. We can think of in this example, we have a phase probability of success of our current phase. We imagine this asset is in phase 1 of a 55% likelihood that we're going to succeed and a 45% chance that we're going to fail. We then need to ladder on that our phase 2 risk, our phase 3 risk, and our regulatory approval, ultimately to get to this full probability of technical and regulatory success, which measures from where we are today to the point that this asset will hit the market. What's the likelihood of making a successful transition through all of the phases that we expect in that period? Now, a critical component of this, and a very challenging component, is that in order to do this calculation, we need to project for future phases what that probability is conditional on success of the previous phase. So we need to assume that we've got success, because obviously you're not likely to succeed in phase 2 if you haven't succeeded in phase 1 for obvious reasons. So if we've structured it in a way that each of those phases has a conditionally independent probability of success, what that allows us to do is to get to this final PTRS number by simply multiplying through the numbers that we get for each phase. So the 10.2% that you can see on the chart here is the multiplication of the 55%, the 30%, 65%, and the 90%. And so it's important, as you're doing this aspect, to ensure that you have mathematical consistency to get to this ultimate probability of technical and regulatory success. So where does risk typically manifest in a drug development plan? Now, it's important to note here that often, as we're going through these slides today, we're going to be talking about a typical development plan. Development plans will often be atypical. There may be missed phases, there may be combined phases, there may be other things, and each of those requires its own nuance when we're calculating it. But for a simplification for today's exercise, we're going to assume that we are going through a traditional kind of drug development plan. So as we move from phase 1 to phase 2, typically we'll see a relatively low risk discharge. The most significant risk discharge typically happens at phase 2, and then post phase 3, what we'd historically see is that your registrational PTRS is normally very high, and by the end of phase 3, typically very little risk remains. Now, I know that many organizations historically would have seen this kind of S-shaped curve for the PTRS getting discharged at each phase. I think it is important to note that many organizations now are investing in more robust mechanisms for really understanding the regulatory success, and there is a number of advancements in methodology in kind of moving away from kind of just using a flat 95% assumption for regulatory success, as the regulatory environment is a complex and ever evolving one, and so being robust in how you go about approaching that is critical. Now, PTRS is linked to a particular point in time, and many organizations, I think, fail to document this in a meaningful way, which can lead to challenge across the organization as discussions around PTRS are happening. So we need to remember that PTRS is created using data about the project, data about the environment in which the project is sitting, the competitive landscape, the regulatory environment, etc., data about the organization, and often current expert opinion on this space as well. And all of those things are coming together in order to form that PTRS. Now, all of that information can update on a continuous basis. There's all manner of things that are happening throughout the life of a project, and can often change during a phase. So it's not a case that we would assign this probability of success at the start of a phase and then nothing changes until we get to the end of the phase and we're at the next kind of major governance decision. What typically happens is that there are often interim analysis or competitor updates or other things which will impact that PTRS. And so ensuring that we have a continual method for reviewing and analysing whether that PTRS remains the right view of risk for the organisation is critical. But it's also critical to ensure that we are time coding the PTRSs that we are creating. And often that time coded element can get separated from the values, which can make management of these numbers in an organisation difficult. So we would talk about these points where PTRS changes as being the key inflection points for an asset. And this is really when risk gets discharged. And so it's important when constructing and utilising PTRS to be clear on when these key inflection points are going to occur and how PTRS is likely to be amended at this point in time. So this is something that should be done kind of a priori. It should not be the case that kind of you're coming across major elements which are shifting your PTRS, which you hadn't anticipated. That shouldn't occur. And actually, right at the start of a phase, you should be identifying where these major inflection points sit. So they go beyond kind of end of phase published readouts, and as I mentioned before, can include competitor readouts and interim analysis. It's also important to note that when new knowledge becomes available, it's clear to whom that knowledge is available and when. So it may be that at different points in the organization, visibility to information shifts. A lot of the information coming out of these studies is very confidential, and also there are kind of regulations around when and then what needs to be published and what can be visible to whom. And so ensuring that you have a clear mechanism internally for managing who has visibility to what updates on some of these key inflection points can be key, and something that I have seen organizations historically trip themselves up over. So earlier we talked about kind of phase POS or PTRS of being the kind of progression probability as assets are moving through. And so as we are thinking about that, we need to imagine our decision tree that we have here inclusive of those key inflection points that I mentioned. So this is really just honing in on one phase and extending it beyond what we saw earlier to say, you know, if this is our current phase, this is the decision on the next phase on whether we're going to progress or not. Actually, there might be key inflections in the middle, and the asset could either succeed or fail at those kind of key inflection points as well. In this case, in this case, an interim analysis, and so our phase POS and ultimately our phase PTRS, when we ladder this up, should be inclusive of all of those risks. Now, how these key inflection points impact the overall PTRS often can happen in unintuitive ways and actually needs to be quite finely managed and should be considered very carefully, as I was mentioning at the start of the definition of the phase PTRS. And so one of the things that I typically see trip people up is that when you include an interim analysis in a phase, typically development teams will often think that this will increase their probability of success. But actually, because you are giving another opportunity in which to terminate the asset, just from a kind of statistical basis, actually including these interim analyses often will decrease the probability of success. Now, that doesn't make it the wrong thing to do. Often it is still very much the right thing to do. But that change in probability is something that often development teams struggle with. And so thinking very carefully about these elements is critical. So we've talked here about PTRS, POS, assurance, pace, a number of different elements of risk. But obviously, this is only one component of risk that a pipeline overall within an organization is facing. And if we think about asset valuations, which is often a key use case for these PTRS or POS estimates, there are a number of other risks that need to be brought to bear or to be understood. And so we've talked here about PTRS and POS. We also need to think about commercial risk. We need to think about timeline risk, and we need to think about development cost risk. And it's important to think about these items independently, but also think how they interrelate in order to provide your overall risk picture. And obviously this ladders up to asset risk and then pipeline risk overall as you look at these elements across a pipeline. And there are other risks that you would bring in, but we won't go into those now. But I think what is critical and often misunderstood is that PTRS is really independent of commercial risk. So commercial risk is something that needs to be understood, needs to be mapped out. But PTRS is really looking at what is the likelihood that this is going to make it to market, and then what happens post it making to market. Then all sits in commercial risk. But it is important to understand all of these different elements of risk and bring them all together in order to ensure that you have robust decision making. So that's a little bit of a high level background into the topic and some definitions. We'll briefly talk about some of the core uses of probability of success. I think a lot of people have visibility to some of the ways that these numbers are used in an organization or cross organizations, but very few people have actually seen where they can be used holistically. And so I think it's important to start by understanding whom uses it. And in this case, really, there's two main kind of places, organizations who will use these PTRS numbers. And they will derive these numbers actually off different data sets because they have visibility to different things based on where they sit. So your biopharma organizations or organizations who are charged with actually developing the assets, they will be key users of this. But also investors. And so people who are investing in companies who are developing these assets are also acutely interested in what the likelihood of these things are succeeding, because that will determine the overall value of that company in the future. I'm going to focus mostly on the biopharma organization use cases as I go through this section, but some of them also apply to the investor or analyst community as well. So within a biopharma organization, really we can think about the use cases sitting at three different levels. So there's the asset development team level, so the teams who are charged with actually kind of managing these assets through their development plans. There's an R&D portfolio level for individuals who are kind of looking across the entirety of the R&D portfolio and have to make choices about what to progress and where. And then at an enterprise level, so organizations overall will also be keen users of these numbers in order to achieve some of those enterprise objectives as well. So what do those use cases look like? So for an asset team, and I think this is probably the use case that people are most commonly familiar with, they will typically be using PTRS for three main things, really to determine whether they have the right strategy. So deciding between clinical development plan alternatives. So you might work up a PTRS for various different options and use that as part of your decision-making plan around which clinical development plan you want to go after. They might be using it just to determine whether the plan that they have is viable at all, whether it's a viable approach. And they will keenly be using it also, combining it with the value and cost elements in order to build out the project valuation. So there's that understanding of the return on investment that this asset will bring to the organization. So that is the use cases that people will typically be familiar with and most often have used PTRS for. At a portfolio level, however, there's a whole host of other use cases that these numbers will feed into. So the first and most obvious one of these is making decisions on whether to pass a project through a governance milestone. So anytime we come to milestone, there's a choice about whether the organization wants to invest to progress it to the next phase or not. The PTRS will be a big component of the organization making that decision. The PTRS is also used as part of portfolio prioritization. So looking across the entirety of options that exist within that pipeline and making decisions on which of those to prioritize, which align to the strategy and have a risk profile and reward profile which is favorable for the organization. PTRS will play heavily into that. As I mentioned earlier, understanding key events that will change the perception of the pipeline and the assets is something that the portfolio will be keenly interested in. So typically organizations will have some form of key event monitoring where they will be triggered based on these PTRSs. They will use it for resource management. So organizations typically have vast number of people who are working on these projects, and understanding how many people they're going to need at each phase, at each point in time is a real challenge for these organizations, making sure that you've got the right number of people with the right skills in the organization requires a lot of foresight and planning. And so ensuring that you've got a robust PTRS so you have a good understanding of what's likely to come down the pipeline is critical. And so it will be heavily used in resource management as well as budget management. So ensuring that obviously you've got the money in the plan in order to deliver on the plans that you want. And finally, R&D will also use it as a communication tool internally with the broader organization or potentially externally as well. From an enterprise level, the main use cases are typically more financial in nature than they would be within an R&D portfolio nature, which is just a function of the role that each of these different parties is playing. One common element is around pipeline valuation. So understanding what's the value of the pipeline overall, what's the return on investment that might be coming out of that pipeline, understanding that overall pipeline value. That is something that obviously the investor and the analyst community, which I talked about earlier, are also critically interested in. The enterprise will typically use PTRS and other such numbers for strategic capital allocation. So making decisions on how much to invest in R&D overall versus other parts of the organization. It's commonly used as part of and I can never say this word, and apologies for that. I always want to say remuneration when I mean remuneration, but basically how much we pay people, either in bonuses to senior execs or to the R&D team or other metrics, often rely on PTRS in their in their calculation, because all of these things, there's a lot of inherent uncertainty, and your best understanding of that uncertainty is captured within these PTRS numbers. It forms the basis of understanding the long-term forecast of the organization, and therefore the overall organizational health, and helps determine the organizational strategy as part of mergers and acquisitions, but also in determining what it is that organizations want to discuss externally through their investor relations activities. So typically organizations won't be publishing the numbers that they have for probabilities of success. These are typically very sensitive numbers within an organization, but they might use that to determine what and how they want to have conversations with other parties in the external world. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of the breadth of spaces that these numbers can operate, and also why it's so critical that they're accurate, because it can have such a huge implication on the viability of R&D and the enterprise as a whole, that these numbers really reflect the organizational understanding of the uncertainty that exists within the pipeline. And each one of these topics could be a whole webinar in its own right, but I'll leave it there for now and hand back to Simone, who's going to take us through a little bit of how one goes about defining these numbers.
Thank you very much, David. So I think it's clear to everyone that probability of success, these numbers are used across the entire organizations at all levels, from the enterprise strategic level all the way down to the operational level with the clinical teams, asset teams. So how do we actually get to these numbers? First of all, I should say that several examples out there, gold standard examples from biopharma organizations, have such deep experience with this that it can generate very accurate PTRS assessments over time. So this is a worthwhile investment for teams. So it's not sometimes you probably might hear that this is just voodoo and no one will know whether it's a positive or negative trial, but it is possible to generate accurate estimates. So here's a handful of typical methodologies. So this the adjusted benchmark methodology, which we will give an example of that later. And then we have the statistical assurance one, which is a slightly more advanced one, more versatile one. We'll not cover that today. And then there's the factor-based scoring frameworks. That's a more qualitative framework that's often used in the drug discovery part of the organization that David talked about before. And then there's a whole range of various predictive models based on AI and machine learning. And some organizations, they just use the benchmark, they look up in a table, and then they use that raw number without any modification. I think that's pretty bad practice, because it's basically saying we don't know anything about the molecule that would tell us to adjust that probability up or down. So here's an example of a benchmark, and I picked one that you can Google and download yourself. So that's an example that, as I mentioned earlier on the webinar, that phase success depends on the therapeutic area you're in, and it depends very much also on the phase. We especially see here that that phase 2, which I call the valley of death, so it's very difficult for a molecule to make it through phase 2. And you see, yeah, we'll get back to that. So besides the crude table that I just showed here, there's plenty of proprietary, typically very expensive tools out there. But maybe the first bullet point, that it's actually possible to generate your own, either in-house historical data you could generate, but also if you just look at clinical trials within your area that have read out, then you can actually generate relevant or very relevant benchmarks. But otherwise, there are these tools with different setups. There's also literature, but it's typically they're not so useful for an industry setting, and sometimes the methodology varies. But they're out there. And I hand this to you, David.
Sure. So one of the things that's common across all of the approaches that Simone outlined, and we'll go through one in an example very shortly, is that they all combine data and expert judgment in some fashion. And so I'm a Bayesian statistician, so I view the world in quite a Bayesian way. So that's a bit of a bias that I will share. But I would say that probability of success and PTRS, they're inherently Bayesian in nature, in that they are a statement of belief of the organization, and different people will have different probabilities assigned for the same asset, depending on what information they have available and their prior experience and those sorts of things. But given this, regardless of the method that you are using for doing your POS or PTRS assessment, it's critical that you have some robust method put in place for dealing with some of the idiosyncrasies that come out from the use of expert judgment. So using expert judgment as data in processes is not an easy thing to do. And typically we need to go through a process of expert elicitation, which is through facilitated workshops or other things, but is essentially working out how do we get knowledge out of experts' heads in a way that is meaningful and useful for the problem that we're trying to solve. And then secondly, judgment aggregation. So how do we, when we have kind of elicited this information, when we have this information that these experts have provided us, how do we combine these elements together?
God.
So it seems there's one that's not muted. Okay, I'll just mute. Sorry, David, go ahead.
Thanks. Typically then, how do we aggregate judgment together in a way that allows us to meaningfully combine judgment from multiple experts? Now, I think it is important to note that you may have a framework such as an AI prediction process which doesn't utilize expert judgment explicitly. It might work in a different way, but I think it's fair to say that almost all elements will combine some form of data and expert judgment. So how do you go about doing these things? How do you go about eliciting knowledge from experts, and how do you go about aggregating these judgments together? Well, there's a whole lot of literature and many different ways that you can go about approaching this. Expert elicitation, there's hundreds of different approaches that are used for expert elicitation. So one often way is kind of using balls and bins method, where you're asking people to put balls in bins to represent the uncertainty that they feel. People are very bad at thinking in terms of probability distributions. Probability distributions doesn't mean anything to people in a kind of a logical sense, and so you can't elicit those directly. You need these elicitation methods to try and infer them. And so getting people to put balls in bins or a probability wheel, or getting them to express their probability verbally. I'm not going to go into all of these methods, but know that there's a lot of literature out there, and if people are interested, we can run a whole webinar or a whole series of webinars on approaches for kind of expert elicitation. But then once we've elicited the information from the experts, typically in the form of of uncertainty distributed over some element, we then, as I mentioned, need to aggregate those together. And typically there are three methods for doing that type of aggregation. So there are behavioral methods. So people may be familiar with the Delphi method, or very common in the drug development space, the shelf method. So these methods are essentially where you are getting people together to discuss and combine their probabilities and their beliefs, and to challenge one another, or to challenge their own thinking in a way that allows them to essentially converge to an agreed number at the end of the process. So that's a behavioral form of judgment aggregation. There are other methods which combine expert judgment mathematically. So basically directly just kind of averaging across them, you could think of, which is called pooling, or there's a model called Cook's classical model, or Bayesian methods. Now these have pluses and minuses versus the behavioral approaches in terms of A, robustness, and B, in terms of how you handle challenges and biases in the process. But then you also have a final set of approaches, which are combination approaches, which try and have an element of behavioral approaches and an element of mathematical approaches. And so you might have something such as the IDEA protocol or the probabilistic Delphi protocol, which actually I was one of the kind of original authors of with the fantastic Kevin Wilson at Newcastle University, who kind of led that work. But these combination approaches also try and take the best of both the behavioral and the mathematical approaches together in order to combine to create that judgment. So essentially, as you're thinking through your process within your organization or wherever you might be, thinking clearly about kind of what approaches you're going to use to elicit judgment and what approaches you're going to use to aggregate that judgment is critical. And through all of this, you need to be very conscious of the fact that human beings are inherently biased, and they have many different cognitive biases which need to be managed. So there are about 13 biases typically which have been identified as common going through expert elicitation in the drug development space. But 5 of the top ones, I believe, personally, are these 5 here. So, there's a confirmation bias where teams will tend to overweight data that supports their desired mechanism or their hypothesis and discount contradictory signals. There's optimism bias or overconfidence. Everyone's very invested in these drugs making it through, and so that can be a systematic tendency to assume higher efficacy or cleaner safety than's justified, and that can happen a lot when you get some early promising signals but not sufficient data actually really to meaningfully adjust your belief. Anchoring, or the opposite of this often, which is base rate neglect. So R&D teams can anchor on some of the earlier effect size, some of the preclinical model outputs or benchmark success rates, even when they're not directly related to the program. Groupthink and social conformity. This is something that comes up quite a lot in behavioral approaches that I mentioned before. So teams will often converge towards a consensus probability of success that reflects their internal dynamics. And so we need to be careful about the kind of senior stakeholder preferences overwriting the knowledge of people who are closer to the details of some of these things. And there's some really interesting work that I know some of the people on this call have tapped into before from Mark Bergman, which shows how seniority and accuracy in forecasting are often not correlated in any way, shape, or form. And so being very careful about that in your organization is also critical. And finally, escalation of commitment. As risk increases, teams can often maintain high POS estimates because the alternative, stepping back, is emotionally or politically costly, particularly as elements are further through the development pipeline. And so thinking carefully about how all of these biases are going to be managed as part of any process and asking critical questions is key. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to Simone, who will give us an example of an elicitation approach in practice.
Thank you very much, David. So now we have covered some theory, some statistics, mathematics, and also psychology around biases. So I'll probably also add a little bit of art to the mix, because it's no matter what methodology you apply, it's going to be tricky, and there's going to be judgment involved. So here I picked one question. We have one of the first ones we actually posted on the Pipeline Signal platform around Novo Nordisk's EVOKE phase 3 trial program in Alzheimer's with semaglutide. And I've boiled it down and simplified it so it fits the webinar here. So what you'll hear in the next 5 minutes or so is something that could take an asset team days or weeks to produce. And of course, it'll be much more verbose and more material involved. So I've broken it down to a few steps. So the first one seems obvious and trivial, actually agreeing on what are we assessing, what are we predicting, how do we define success and often you would have to sit with asset teams for several rounds to actually agree on what does it actually mean exactly. And here we're a little bit spoiled because we actually provided the question for the participants in the pipeline signal here. So here it says we are assessing whether Novo Nordisk will issue press releases on the success of both trials, statistically significant. So of course this is roughly similar to what we could have defined if we were sitting inside an organization. We could also have included other aspects like safety or secondary endpoints. But here at least we have a clear, specific, unambiguous question. And maybe you'll just note that we actually put in both here just to make a little bit some extra fun in this assessment. So we actually have to assess that both trials will come out positive, just to be a little bit playful. So the next thing we ask is, what do we know about the asset? And if we are doing this inside an organization, of course, we have probably worked on this asset for the last 5 or maybe 7, 10 years. So of course, there's a lot of expertise inside the organization among all the subject matter experts, but there's also in the clinical literature and clinicaltrials.gov academic papers, you can find a lot. And just on this particular program, you can see I can find the trial design, I can see what the assumptions on the mean difference in the primary endpoint, and even the standard deviation on the effect, and so on, and I have the power. So actually I can get a lot of information here, and also baseline characteristics. So it's actually, I'm spoiled with all the information I can find in the public domain. Let's say that I want to assess this as a competitor. And obviously there's also investor material from the companies, and these are also publicly available data points. And not to go into it, but just here you can see that Novo Nordisk has sort of 3 pillars of evidence here: real world evidence trials, some other randomized clinical trials, and preclinical studies. But all of these are indirect evidence. So yeah, it works, or the class works, or appears to work, but can we actually translate this, or should we translate it into a belief in success that semaglutide would work in Alzheimer's? So the next question is, okay, so now we need a base rate or a benchmark, or basically asking, so for historically, how have projects of this type fared? How successful? How many have failed? Because we want sort of a numbers. Where are we roughly? Is it like 5% likelihood that this is going to succeed, or is it 95%? So where are we? And for that, we can use the various benchmarks. And here was the crude example I showed earlier. So at least if we just on the surface, we will just jump in and say, okay, this is a phase 3. So it should be, for neurology, it should be 53%. But David here also explained that we are talking about conditional probability. So here I'm assuming that all the preceding phases were positive. But wait, I don't actually have a phase 2 or proof of concept study for semaglutide in Alzheimer's. So I can't use this. So maybe I have to say I'm actually stacking up all the risk from phase 2 and phase 3 into my phase 3 program. So maybe I should multiply and say maybe it's roughly 14%. But then as you start looking deeper into what benchmark you would like to use, other things start to creep in. So you're also, okay, so but what is the modality? So in this case, it's a peptide. So it's not somewhere between a small molecule and an antibody. So we also know that, as you saw on some of the other charts, that also gives different benchmarks. So then is it a novel mechanism of action? Well, there's already a lot of GLP-1s out there, but not in Alzheimer's. So, and is it a new molecular entity, or is it life cycle management? And obviously, semaglutide is already on the market for various indications, and also in various products. So actually, that would be some of the factors I would try to sort of get a more granular view on the benchmark. But just to show that this could be a starting point, let's say 14%. But also we know that it's quite interesting that Alzheimer's, especially around the disease modifying therapies, historically the failure rate has been like 100%. So then I should start with a benchmark of 0% chance of success, which is probably too harsh, but that just shows how high the bar is for succeeding in this area. And of course we have the anti-amyloid class, where we have 3 products, one of which is now discontinued, but that's not GLP-1 receptor agonism. This is the anti-amyloid antibodies. So So maybe I'm somewhere around, let's say 5%, just to make a quick estimate of where I would start. And then we'll ask myself, so now if I say that on average such a product would have maybe a 5% chance of success in phase 3, also considering we don't have a proof of concept and it's disease modifying therapy. So let's say we start at 5% as our benchmark to simplify it. And then I'll start stacking up the pros and cons. So then I can say, okay, but I really lack of convincing proof of concept for this mechanism of action in Alzheimer's disease. So everything is like not anecdotal evidence, but it's very indirect, and we know the bar is extremely high for demonstrating efficacy with a new mechanism in Alzheimer's. But on the other hand, there is this quite interesting indirect supporting evidence. So I had the -5, so that took me to 0. But then I said, let's add 5 percentage points. So then I'm at +5. And then I give credit also to it's a very well-designed, well-powered trial. But of course, if the molecule doesn't work, it doesn't matter how well-designed or how well-powered the trial is, then it won't show an effect. But I think it gives it a fair chance. And then we can say semaglutide is already approved in other indications. So it's not like I would run into liver toxicity in phase 3 with this molecule in Alzheimer patients. But of course, other safety issues could show up in this patient population, but that's also unlikely given the real world evidence. So that takes me to 14%, which was actually the number I forecasted in the system. Just as an example, a quick back of the envelope assessment. And also it's usually very helpful to quantify your uncertainty in one way or another. One aspect is for communication purposes. So this is a relatively narrow band, saying I think it's probably not could not be lower than 5%, and I'm not willing to go above 15%. So, and I think through the different forecasts I had was from 7% to 14%. But if you then zoom out a little bit, say, okay, what's the big picture here? We're definitely in the red area here. So this immediately aligns expectations. If someone in the organization was assuming, okay, this is 70% chance, it's such a wonderful molecule, and it's not. I mean, it often happens that we actually see that there's a discrepancy internally in organizations how they actually assess it. So, and that is why we should also be extremely careful with the words we use. And here I just picked one from the UK Defence Intelligence, how they talk about probabilities in their intelligence assessments. So you can see, in this case, I could just, if it's maybe a stakeholder not too familiar with probabilities, then I can, okay, it means it's highly unlikely this is gonna work. That's the message. And then each organization should have like a specified list of terms, because otherwise, if it's not specified, I mean, research shows that highly likely can mean anything from basically 5% to 95%. So we should be very careful with the words we attach.
And then,
yeah.
So sorry to interrupt. We've just had a quick question, which I think it would be good to raise, which goes back to your slide 4 or step 4, which is that in here you showed a number of updates to the probability based on the various different elements.
Yeah.
And with quantification against that. And so the question that was raised was how do you go about working out how much to adjust the benchmark by? Obviously, this is the crux or the biggest challenge in this space is how do you once you've identified these modulating factors, how do you go about actually determining the probability adjustment that you're making off the back of them?
Yeah, and I think that is exactly the crux, because it's extremely difficult to because again, we don't have, if we had GLP-1s, like 10 different GLP-1 molecules that have been through Alzheimer trials like this, then we could have like a frequent test. Then we could have a real benchmark saying, do GLP-1s actually work in Alzheimer's disease? But we don't know. This is the largest GLP-1 trial in Alzheimer's. So this is the first time. So that goes back to the probability being a degree of belief rather than a frequency of observed events. So it's maybe more, and I think that's something you will debate with the teams, but it's just to understand this. It's not like you see this as single-digit numbers. So it's not like, okay, so we have this indirect evidence, so I'm going to add 50%. So it's actually, usually I challenge teams to say, okay, do you really believe this is different than an average project at this stage? Do you really believe you should move the needle Yeah, but we have good phase 2 data if that's the case. Yeah, but I mean, doesn't an average project have decent phase 2 data to go into phase 3? So here we're actually going into phase 3 without phase 2 data. It could also be that there was no signal in phase 2 and you still go into phase 3. So I think that's again the art aspect of it. And I think it also then goes back to, so one thing is for the specific one, but then over time, which we don't have time to cover today, but it's actually possible to measure accuracy over time. When we see this, if an organization has many readouts, you can actually start to see if they have molecules that they predict 14%, then 14% of the time they should come out positive. But it is really an art. But usually you can see also in predictive models based on AI, machine learning, that the different factors are usually quite small, but there can be a lot. So it's also a sum of small increments or penalties. So it's definitely tricky, this part.
Yeah. Yeah, no, completely agree. And I guess just to add to that, or to reframe what you were saying slightly, I think the point you were making about the reason why we're using expert judgment is because you can't have data, or data doesn't exist in this space, is a really critical one here. And I think sometimes what we find is that organizations, some of the modulations that you might want to make to that benchmark can be inferred from data, or there is some data that's available which can create an update that could be made to the benchmark in a more kind of mechanistic or mathematical way. What the recommended approach for doing that is essentially to create an adjusted benchmark where you're overlaying on top of the benchmark with all of the actual data that you have that allows you to modulate that benchmark. And there are a number of different organizations which have published papers on how one goes about doing that. And then leave for expert judgment those areas, as Simon was outlining, where it's simply not possible because data doesn't exist, which is why you're going to expert judgment in the first place. So there might be an additional step, kind of a 4.1 and 4.2 on this slide. 4.1, which is taking your base rate and then updating in a data-based way to get your adjusted benchmark, and then 4.2, which is then overlaying that additional subjective knowledge, which can't be captured in the data for whatever reason, and helping teams go through the process of assigning that probability for that expert judgment piece is where the art and the science meet, and the facilitation approaches you use and other things to help teams go through that is critical.
Yeah, and I think also maybe practically, I also saw a Novo executive talking in the media about that it's a 1 in 10 chance of this making it. So I think that's probably how an executive would see this number. Okay, it's a 1 in 10 chance that this is gonna work. And then remember, this is a quite tricky one, but let's say it had been a GLP-1 in obesity, then the base rate would have been at least 10 times higher, right? Then we're probably talking maybe 70 plus percentage points, and then there could be factors would make it higher or lower. But even if you had picked 10% or 0% as the base rate, we're not able to move ourselves out of that deep hole of extreme high risk, and that is what this bet is. It is a calculated bet in a very difficult disease. So, and I can see there's some questions also on the general perception on the data, but also from Eli Lilly. So maybe let me just quickly note on this. Besides having this as a communication tool for the belief, also that it's something that's quite handy also for sensitivity analysis for, let's say, running Monte Carlo simulations on valuation or portfolio simulations. So that's why it's good. And sometimes you just have so high uncertainty, you have very little data to assess because you don't have access to documents, or it's a competitor. Then the range is typically the broader, the more uncertain you'll be, and there's more way to actually indicate the level of confidence in the estimate. And quickly, so we had this question on the pipeline signal platform where of 21 forecasts, we had 12%, which was definitely indicating this is a high risk one. So basically, people believe there was almost a 90% risk that this is gonna fail. So, but still, we don't have we don't have the track record to claim that this is accurate or not. And even my own forecast, that could be just a lucky guess. So we have to consistently over time to see if we're actually well-calibrated forecasters. And now we actually spoiled, or at least spoiled in a sense, we know the outcome of the trial, the program here, and it didn't work. Novo issued a press release in November, and actually last night, I just made a quick slide. They presented some more details on the top line results. And here you can see exactly, that's maybe a little bit hard to see, but actually you can see it's basically flat as a pancake, to be a little bit blunt. So actually both the semaglutide group and the placebo group, they deteriorated as expected actually in the original clinical trial design paper. But there was no slowing in the disease by semaglutide. So you can see very, very small, unfortunately. And also then we have the biomarkers, and that's why you see some of the Novo Nordisk folks talk about, okay, maybe there's something here, maybe you could look into some biomarker signals. But at the end, the clinically relevant outcome, it was flat as a pancake, and that's my personal take on these data. So, but also if you look at the stock price, you could see how it dropped on the day they announced this. So it's also how the perception on risk, the perception on value tied into this. We'll share the slides and then you can sign up if you want to join and start forecasting. But now we should hand it over to our very special guest. So we have Zach with us here, and he can actually claim to be a pro forecaster. Maybe not in biopharma, but he can teach us, tell us about how to get started with forecasting. So please, Zach, take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Simone. Thanks, Dave. I've really appreciated the presentation thus far. It's I wish I could bring you guys along to other clients and partners we have, because this was a great explanation of how to forecast and why it's important and different biases we might have. So we'll dive in. Again, my name is Zach Siewert. I'm with Cultivate Labs, so we're partnered with Dave and Simone. Working on pipeline signal. So this is the crowd forecasting aspect of the work they're doing. We run the platform behind it, and we work with clients across a number of different industries. And so, our bread and butter is actually in government and intelligence agencies, think tanks. This kind of thinking and process is used by groups trying to predict, the next war that's going to come out. Anything from drug predictions, financial predictions, military movements, and things along those lines. All of them use crowdsourced forecasting as part of their process, or a lot of them do. And so we work with a lot of these clients on those, and we also work in the pharmaceutical space as well. And so that's why you're seeing this connection. But what's interesting here is that forecasting.
Is the slides moving, or is it just on my
no,
side? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no worries. And so while my background is in finance, I was investing in hedge funds previously at a big Canadian asset manager. I've since moved into the forecasting space, in part because in finance, a lot of people make very bad forecasts very confidently a lot of the time. And so that sparked my interest in finding, okay, how can we do this a little bit better? And obviously, the skill set that you use to forecast is the same whether you're forecasting in pharmaceuticals or in finance or elsewhere. The data changes, the availability of information changes, but the skill set is the same. And so we'll cover a little bit of that today as well. One thing to bear in mind is that every decision we make really is a forecast about the future, and you can really think of yourself as a Bayesian or as a forecaster in many different things. And so obviously the simplest is what am I going to have for breakfast? It's a forecast on what am I going to enjoy, what's going to be healthy and healthy for me in the long term, and you're going to make a decision based on what you suspect is true. Now, obviously, that's a simple example that doesn't have much impact on your life, but it's a forecast that we're making. And so, what's interesting about that is that we're actually very bad at forecasting as individuals. Over and over, studies have shown we're not particularly good at predicting the future, and so that's a concern. We have a lot of common biases, and we've already discussed a lot of these today, and they'll lead to major errors in judgment. And one of the keys is relying on our inside view versus the outside view. And so this is another way of phrasing what Simone and Dave were talking about with base rates and the information. You want to have an anchor that brings you to reality first and then adjust that later. And so when we're looking at pharmaceutical data, you want to start with, okay, what has historically happened in this phase, and then I'm going to make those adjustments just like he's been doing. That's been done across many different disciplines. And so, we'll see that even again with our think tank clients, where it's okay, we're trying to predict what's next with the trade war between the US and elsewhere. Well, what has historically happened with movements in trade? What has the Trump administration done or Republican administrations done historically when it comes to trade talks? And so we'll bring in the outside view, what has happened previously, and then start to adjust based on what we have. So we fall into a lot of these traps as humans. It's very difficult to overcome, but knowing that we fall into these traps is the first step to then say, okay, how am I going to avoid this? And so we'll talk about that a little bit further. What's doubly disappointing, though, is experts are actually quite bad and often worse at forecasting than a layman. And so often when you're an expert in a field, you're what's often described as a hedgehog. And so you have a specific view of the world, a lens through which you view the world, and then everything gets filtered through that lens. A good forecaster is called a fox, and the idea is that they know many little things, and so they don't have one lens of viewing the world. Rather, they keep updating their viewpoint based on new information, and that's going to be key to being a good forecaster. And so even as an expert, and there's a lot that experts bring to forecasting that's very important, a lot of information and know-how that a layman won't have, but they also need to bear in mind this idea of, okay, I need to bring in new information and not always filter it through my own particular view. And so one of the ways that we avoid the issues of having these biases and different information is that, first of all, we can train people. You can reduce bias. You can get better at forecasting, and there's a ton of research behind this. You can look at the work from Phil Tetlock. He wrote a book called Super Forecasting, which covers a lot of this. And so you are able to train and get better. But the other part is actually bringing a group of people together, getting them all to forecast and getting their results and aggregating them actually produces a much more accurate forecast. And so there's actually a number of reasons for that. But what happens is when you bring a group of people together, they all have some information that contributes towards the truth. We know there is some sort of truth. There is some probability that is actually accurate for your likelihood. And everyone who comes and makes a forecast has some information, whether they're very acquainted with the drug and they're working on the project, whether they're outside, they're watching stock, they're watching what other similar drugs at competitors and how they've performed. All of these people have some information that contributes towards an accurate prediction. They also all have some biases. They're all going to have, okay, maybe I'm working on the project, therefore I think it's more likely to succeed because I'm working on it and I'm doing a good job. Or you're at a competitor and you think, okay, yeah, these guys don't know anything, it's a lot less likely to succeed, et cetera, et cetera. There's a number of different biases, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But all of these biases, if you get a diverse crowd, these biases are actually largely random. And so that's one of the keys here is all the information, all the true information points the same direction, but your biases are largely random. So if everyone comes from the exact same school, works at the same company, reads the same information, this won't work quite as well because your biases will be more similar. But if you have a group of diverse, intellectually diverse people, the biases start to cancel each other out. And that's why when we aggregate a forecast and take the average, we get a very accurate forecast. And so that's what we're talking about here with Siewert did this research back in 2005. A diverse group of people can be smarter and less biased than individual experts. One of the most basic original discoveries of this was Sir Francis Galton. He was a mathematician, He discovered at a county fair you could place a bet on how much an ox would weigh, and then whoever had the most accurate bet would win the meat of the ox. And so just like guessing the number of jelly beans in a jar. And he found that if you averaged out all of the guesses, which came from a huge range of people, it was within a pound or two of the actual weight of the ox, whereas the guesses were all over the place. So this is where that was first discovered, and that's just been repeated over and over and over again. And you see that even in something like restaurant reviews, where a restaurant has a 4.5 stars, you can be fairly confident that it is actually going to be a good restaurant, because once you hit 100 people reviewing it, you have a pretty good idea of whether that was accurate or not. The last part there, which is actually quite interesting, is that the crowd is more accurate across topical domains, performing better than individuals. So you will see individuals beating the crowd once in a while. But what you won't see is an individual that is consistently better than a crowd across a number of questions. And so obviously, if you're making a forecast, your forecast might be more accurate once in a while, but if you're able to gather a group of people together, that group will be more consistent than you as an individual will be able to be. And just lastly, before we move on here, how we know all this information is through the forecasting research. What we do is we actually score people's forecasts. And so rather than saying, yeah, this is probably going to happen or that might happen, we do get people to put numbers on their forecast, and you'll see that in Pipeline Signal. It's a percentage from 0 to 100, and then you're actually able to be scored on it. So if you said 5%, your colleague said 20%, and it turned out not to happen, then you were more accurate than your colleague. You're going to receive a better score. Over time, over many forecasts, you're able to develop a reputation of, okay, he is quite accurate. Or she maybe is a little bit optimistic more of the time, and incorrectly so. And so that's how this works. That's how the research has been done. Again, so this is just a little bit more about the background. So a lot of this research is done more recently by the US government. IARPA, it's the intelligence arm doing research into how can we produce better intelligence. They did crowd forecasting studies where they found that oftentimes individuals without private information were actually able to do better than analysts within the CIA or FBI or where have you. And so even without classified information, groups were able to produce better forecasts than individuals within those organizations. So that's where a lot of this comes from. And then out of that, you have a number of organizations like ours that help provide crowd forecasting for different applications. So US intelligence community does this. There's the Alliance for Decision Education, which is a group helping high school students around the US learn how to make better decisions. So they do forecasting. There are some pharmaceutical clients as well. UK government and other governments, and then banking as well will do this. So just briefly, with a few minutes remaining, we'll talk about how to start acting like a good forecaster. So again, we're going to be aggregating people's forecasts on Pipeline Signal, but also individuals can become better forecasters. And that's going to be key when you're talking about probability of success here, is being able to come up with a better forecast and improve over time. So there's a few ways that people go wrong. Gut feel is one of the biggest ones. There is some research that your gut feeling about something can be useful, but where it's useful is typically in an application where you've done something, hundreds or thousands of times. And so if you're talking about, you might hear a story about a firefighter who thinks, oh, the building's going to come down now, we got to get everybody out in the next minute. He might know that from his gut feeling because he's been to many fires, he's practiced on this over and over, and maybe there's something he can't identify that has tipped him off to that, but because he's done this so many times, he's aware of it. When it comes to forecasting, typically your gut feel is not as useful. You're only going to forecast a similar drug this many times. You're not going to be able to develop that same sort of gut feel that maybe a firefighter has or a musician has about music. So we don't want to just go with our gut feel. We've got personal bias. We talked about this. If you might be on the team producing the drug, you're going to have a bias probably to say, hey, this is going to be better than everyone else thinks because we're working so hard on it, or we have more information than everyone and we think it'll work. I succumb to this in my work when it comes to, you know, like a sale to a new client. If it seems to be going so well and we've had all these wonderful meetings and then, you know, someone disappears. It's the exact same sort of process with personal bias. One size fits all, going in saying I'm all in, so I'm going to 100% or 0%. It's going to happen or it's not going to happen. That is going to produce very poor forecasts. And then the last one there is no tracking of prior forecasts. And this is, again, key. I think especially when you're looking at probability of success is you want to be able to look back on your old forecast and say, were we right? And I know there was some discussion of, okay, how do you adjust your baseline? And did we do that accurately? So going back and saying, okay, last time I adjusted a baseline, this is what I did. And did that work or not? Going back and tracking that is really important. Remember, we had the 7 rules that we've discussed here previously. And again, I won't go into too much detail. Simone and Dave have covered this, but you want to define your question clearly, make sure you know, and everyone's referring to the same thing and trying to forecast the exact same thing. So you're not forecasting different things and getting different results. Gather the critical evidence first, start with your base rates. Again, that's going to anchor you to something more realistic and then move on from there. Update with specific information, check for your biases, document the thought process, and update your forecasts. And so that's the other part is, you know, I think a lot of organizations that we've worked with will, you know, make a forecast either at the beginning of a project or maybe they'll update their forecast annually. And a lot of things can change, you know, in 12 months. And so you do want to update your forecasts more frequently. As soon as you get more information, that might move your forecast 1 or 2%. Or if it's big information, maybe you need to make a larger adjustment. But if you're updating frequently, you can make many small adjustments pushing in any given direction. Whereas if you update once a year or even less frequently, you're going to have these huge leaps. And A, you're going to be missing information in between. And B, when you're making those huge leaps, then you start to risk accuracy again because it might be based off of only one bit of information and not collecting everything from the whole year. Part of this is about, you know, just you and how do you know yourself. And so working on developing habits that are make you a better forecaster and attitudes that make you a better forecaster. So being more cautious, knowing that nothing is certain, being more humble, being more actively open-minded. This is one of the keys here, is actively seeking out information that disagrees with your opinion. And so as humans, we have confirmation bias. I think either Simone or Dave talked about this before. We like to see things that agree with our own opinions. And so we have to fight against ourselves and say, okay, how do I find someone that disagrees with me? What are they saying? I might not agree with them in the end, but having read that is going to make me more cautious and make me a little bit more humble about my own beliefs. Reflective, introspective, and self-critical. So this is what we're talking about going back and seeing, how did I adjust? Was that accurate? And then part of that is actually writing down your thoughts of why did I make this adjustment? Studies show that you know, there are forecasts being made about some geopolitical events. Geopolitical events transpired over the next couple of years, and the researcher went back to all of these historians and experts that had made forecasts and said, okay, what forecast did you make? And so then they said, okay, this is the forecast. And first of all of them moved their forecast. Their memory of their forecast changed to be much closer to what actually happened than what they had originally said. Then the researcher went and confronted them with, well, actually, I wrote down what you said, and this is what you said. And then they still were able to squirm and say, well, yeah, okay, I said that, but you know what I really meant was this, and it would have happened if that had happened, et cetera, et cetera. So writing down your own history allows you to have that argument with yourself and confront yourself and say, okay, I wasn't right. I do want to improve, and here's how I can not make that mistake next time. So being reflective. There's a couple other items there: being flexible, being able to change your mind, etc. And then knowing that it is possible to get better. Again, the research shows we can improve ourselves as forecasters. Beyond these basics, there is additional training that can be done. You can do reasoning training, debiasing, tracking your beliefs, and Bayesian inference. So I know Dave has mentioned this right off the top, being thinking like a Bayesian, being able to adjust your views. There are mathematical processes for this, but also just the general understanding of updating. And then a team approach. And so again, we talk about crowd forecasting. That's just bringing a bunch of individuals together. But you can also form a team and do red teaming. So have people assigned to criticize. And a lot of these, again, are very common in government and intelligence agencies. And they're just as applicable when it comes to a corporate or scientific endeavor. So really, again, what we want to remember here is that all of our decisions are based on forecasts of the future, whether we're doing that explicitly or not. And being able to improve this ability to forecast is going to allow us to make better decisions. And obviously, you know that from the discussion of probability of success and other probabilities here in the pharma industry. There are a lot of resources out there to make you a better forecaster and help you train yourself. So there's some books here, and I think the slides will be shared, so you'll be able to see this. But a couple of the highlights are Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. He's a psychologist that did a lot of work in this space and how we think and what biases we have. And then obviously, how do we then actively try and counteract those biases? And then obviously Phil Tetlock in the forecasting space, he's got a short course on super forecasting. He's got a book on super forecasting, and a number of other ones. So those are two highlights, but you can check these out in the slides later as well. And I think that brings us to the Q&A here. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Zach. It was tour de force of the mind and how to forecast. So we have a few minutes for Q&A, and I tried to answer some of the questions in the chat, and I can but maybe we should just start, because I have a poll, and we can see if that can break the ice. So it's a question about how mature is your organization's PTRS/POS capability, just to get us started. So hopefully you have something popping up on your screen. You can click. Let me see. I'm not sure, but it seems 40% says no formal process. So, and then there's some have basic, and then there's like each 1 quarter at intermediate or advanced. So okay, so quite kind of a mixed bag we have here, and probably as expected. I think there's a huge variability among small organizations, mid-size and large organizations, how mature they are. And of course, we should maybe have included the Eli Lilly case study here, how they have done it since the 90s, and they have almost 1,400 assessments. So they also have this beautiful calibration plot. You can see if they say that something is 50 to 60%, then it actually happens with that frequency.
And I think on that one, Simone, I think the Lilly example is a great one, because I think it demonstrates how good you can get at this if you invest properly in this as a discipline. And as you mentioned, their calibration is really high, really positive. But also, I think the importance of thinking through the organizational structure that you're utilizing to do these assessments, and how that enables or hinders you in ensuring that you're getting well calibrated forecasts. And I think what's interesting in that case and a number of other cases is the use of groups who are external to the asset teams themselves, who are involved in the PTRS assignment process, be it either ensuring that you've got calibration across all of those assessments that are being made across the whole organization, or directly involved in making the PTRS numbers themselves. And so, as Zach was outlining, that thinking through how do you organizationally ensure that you've got the right mix of talent against this against this problem is critical. But if you get it right, then you can really deliver well calibrated forecasts.
And I can see there's also a question around the sort of throughput. So how can you automatically provide probabilities if you have many projects? Of course, this can be very time consuming, so you need to make the process fit for purpose. So if it's a $10,000 investment, I think you'll probably do it very fast, not even ask. But if it's like, you know, these Alzheimer trials we discussed where we are talking $1 billion or more, then it's fine to spend maybe a week with a team actually to figure out what are we getting ourselves into here, because you are committing the organization financially and otherwise for many years into the future. So I think it's hard to sort of just scale it up. But of course, then there are these automated predictive tools. But of course, then you're back to the predictive accuracy, whether it's relevant. So it's easy to generate numbers, but generating accurate numbers fast that's the tricky part.
And I think one approach to considering these new types of models, be them AI based or others, is that I think, you know, many organizations are exploring these as a way of scaling up their PTRS's approaches to kind of reduce team time or to kind of increase the scale of or number of forecasts that they're able to make. I think in the short term there needs to be this process of combining taking those outputs as a form of almost updated benchmark, as we were describing earlier, and then overlaying some expert judgment to really ensure you've got that right customization at the end for your final numbers. That has implications over ownership of the numbers and various other pieces, which is also critical in this space. But what is also important, I think, is for organizations to ensure that they are databasing the impact that is happening at each of those steps, so that as you're over time able to disaggregate, okay, this was what the model produced, these were the updates that we were able to make. Actually, were we systemically making it better or systemically making it worse, as Zach was saying before? And that can enable the organization to make the appropriate fine tweaking and changes to get itself into an optimized position.
And maybe I can see there are some maybe if not complaints, then questions about how I arrived at that adjustment on the benchmark. And of course, I cut some corners, but in practice, how one would approach it is that you start talking with the asset or the expert team in a qualitative manner. What are the factors that could drive the probability of success up and down? And then you look at the efficacy, safety, tolerability, for instance. And then without talking about numbers, so that's probably in the next meeting. And then when you have that list of factors making it higher or lower, then you start discussing, okay, what's the weight of the evidence we have here? So how much weight should we put in? And then you have a discussion and contrast the views and opinions and expertise across subject matter areas. And then you go to that. But of course, it's still an art, but at least you have documented that you put a lot of belief in maybe a competitor trial or some in vivo data you had in-house. So again, it should be audible and traceable. Any other questions? I think we got a couple of questions also before the call. I think there was one around how do we actually approach if we have like these where we have a phase 2 or phase 1/2, or we have something where trials looks seamless, or they are like, is it a phase 1 or phase 2? And there are a couple of tricky points there. First is how do we actually find the benchmark for those trials? So is it a phase 1 or is it a phase 2? Because it's hard to, you can't find phase 2A benchmarks or phase 2B benchmarks. So if you're first doing a phase 2A and phase 2B, then there'll be a probability for each, but maybe the benchmark will tell you what is the probability of actually making it through that entire phase. And then you need to have a conversation with the team. How do you distribute the risk between those two phases? And typically the phase 2A, which is the proof of concept part, is much more risky. So you'll probably put more risk on that part, and then the remaining residual risk for that phase, you'll put it on the phase 2B, which is more the dose finding exercise. So it's the same there, but it's a quite tricky exercise to find the benchmarks. So benchmarks are definitely not perfect. So often, also in an organization, we say, okay, but let's just use the benchmark, or what is the benchmark? But there's rarely just one benchmark. You might decide to use just one benchmark, but it's actually very much dependent on how you categorize, how you view and dissect the historical data. So just be aware that, I mean, there's no such thing as one benchmark.
So conscious that we're at the end of time here, Simon. As we've been going through all of this material today, you know, we've done it at a relatively high level, as we mentioned at the start, that people are coming from all sorts of different experiences in this space for this session now. But we are keen, if people are interested and have found it valuable, to run other sessions in the new year and into the future. And so if it is something that you are interested in hearing more about, or would like to input into what topics you'd like to see covered in a bit more detail, or areas to focus, then please do engage with Pipeline Signal. We have a LinkedIn page where you can hear more and also make your suggestions.
But I think with that, reach out if you have any additional questions, and then we'll try to answer them. But thank you so much for participating and contributing to today's webinar. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.